issues related to fellowships applications and applying for things. This fall, we've been doing various applications of AI and ethical and effective use. So this is our final installment. If you found this interesting, the other sessions are archived on our YouTube channel, which you can access through our website. So welcome. My name is Dr. Kyle Mox. I'm Associate Dean for National Scholarships at Arizona State University. And joining me today is Shay Masterson, who is our Program Manager for Outreach and Inclusion. So as you can see, today we're going to be focusing on the final step in many fellowships application processes, which is interview, right? So not a lot of folks maybe have thought about that, of how and why we might apply generative AI to help us interview better. So if we haven't thought about this much, here's an invitation, right? So curious, folks in attendance, if you would rate this prompt as using our traditional scale that we use for AI, green, yellow, or red, meaning in this particular context, does this seem like a productive, useful question or prompt to use? If we're not really sure, it really depends on the intention here. Or red, in this case, we would call that an ineffective prompt. So if we were to ask generative AI, generate 10 possible interview questions based on my personal statement, help group them by theme, would we consider that a productive prompt, not too sure, or would we consider that ineffective? You're welcome to throw your vote in the chat. Shay, what are your thoughts on that? What's your reaction? Oh, yellow. Okay, just popped in. So you're not too sure. Let's talk through that. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think that it could be helpful, but without any context about what those possible interview questions would be for, it's probably going to be on the more ineffective side. Because the questions could end up being not at all related to what you're applying for.
Right. Yeah, so maybe to make this one more effective, we'd want to give more context in terms of what is the award, what are the criteria for it at least, a little bit more context, and so we can get questions that are more closely related to the actual situation, right? Bonus points for giving it the personal statement, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but grouping them by theme, right? Helping us organize our thoughts rather than giving us thoughts. So that puts it in productive. So yeah, I would say this is a greenish yellow or a yellowish green, probably in between. Write me a strong answer for why do you want to be a Truman Scholar? So here we've named the specific scholarship, but yeah, does this look like a green, yellow, or a red prompt, meaning productive, not clear, or perhaps ineffective? What are your thoughts, Shay?
For me, I would go with red, um, because AI is not going to know anything about your personal background or your reasons for applying to the Truman Scholarship. There can be so many different, motivations for that. And so without any context, they're not going to be able to say that. I think there's some other things too, but I'll leave that up for further discussion.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely yellow, right? And I'm not entirely sure if this leans towards red or the green side. I'm going to put it yellow leaning red, which is funny because I wrote it. I wrote the prompt, right? And I'm not entirely sure. And I think that illustrates something interesting about the use of AI because I think it does come down to intention here. If we wrote this prompt with the intention that it was going to write us a perfect answer and we could just memorize that, that would definitely be red, right? That would be an ineffective use of this in this situation. If we were curious to see and we wanted to read critically the answer that the AI generated as a way to, oh, I hadn't thought about framing it that way, or it's interesting how it led with this particular idea. If our intention is more curiosity and critical thinking, then it would be, more in the middle or to the green side. But in terms of, yeah, effectiveness, I think it does need more context as well. So we were good in terms of giving it a fellowship to work with, but not so much in our own personal context. All right, last one. Um, Write the 5 questions I'll be most likely asked in my Marshall interview and provide the most impressive answers. All right. So if you've just joined us, we're rating these prospective AI prompts as green, meaning very productive, seems very useful. Yellow, not too sure, really depends on some things. Or red, yeah, that's definitely an ineffective prompt. So any thoughts on whether this is a green, yellow, or red? Jay, thoughts?
Yes, I for this one I would um, lean towards the yellow red. I think it can be helpful in that reflective piece, like you were saying. Um, but because I understand the context of Marshall applicants and recipients, I also know that there's so many different um, backgrounds and interests and pathways that can make an impressive Marshall scholar. And so it can be kind of skewed.
Mhm.
I think you would get potentially skewed responses there.
Absolutely. Yeah, Yosta puts this as yellow as well. And I would say, yeah, this is definitely yellow. And for me, really getting into red territory is ineffective. And I think where it went south is like the first half of the prompt, I think is perfectly solid, right? What are the 5 most likely questions I'll be asked? And with the assumption that I would provide my application, that would move it more into the more effective category. But asking it for the most impressive answers, you're asking the AI in this particular case to adopt the persona of a potential panel, right? And it can't know what the makeup of those people would be. I can't necessarily know what subjective perceptions they have or personalities. We could try, we could give it a persona, but uh, I think the use of that word impressive signals to me that this particular applicant wants the winning answers and hopes to use that as preparation, which as we're going to unpack today, that's not a terribly effective strategy, right? So by the time we're done with our discussion today, we hope that you'll have a better understanding of how to use AI tools to clarify and organize your thinking, not generate your thinking. Identify effective, limited, and ineffective uses of AI. So again, we'd be better at sort of recognizing whether or not a prompt is useful or ineffective. And then really coming to understand how we still are going to need that human presence human practice to develop what we call presence and composure, and really thinking about how it can support your confidence and mindset. And so that might be counterintuitive, right? To think, how can the AI make me more confident? So if you've gone to any of the other sessions or you view any of the other sessions, up to this point, we've been largely focused on writing, right? And so we've learned how it can ethically, it's been very important and effectively um, be a tool for brainstorming, for organizing and revising our writing. But how can we use generative AI to apply to thinking out loud in real time, which is what an interview is, right? You don't have the luxury of reflection. You don't have the time to make sure your words get crafted correctly. And so from a logistical standpoint, how can AI help with that? And how does that ethical spectrum apply? And so if you've attended any of our other sessions, we've been dealing with this, traffic light metaphor, but in reality, it's more of a spectrum, right? Because I don't think the lines between the three colors are as cut and dried as they might be in some cases. So along the top, we've been rating prompts as all good, caution, and stop when it comes to this particular case, unless you're sitting in a video interview and typing the questions into the AI and reading the responses while you're on Zoom, I don't think there's a way that we can really um, break the ethical barrier, right? Because the AI is not going to be able to represent your words in real time. You still have to do the performance, right? There are certainly other discussions about ethics in AI, but in this particular context, yeah, not so much. So we're really thinking about it more in terms of how purposeful and productive is it or ineffective is it, right? And where are we on that spectrum? So, you know, asking it to write the perfect answers as opposed to seeking feedback, as opposed to just generating potential questions, that's where we are sliding up and down that spectrum. So as we embark on that journey, thinking about, why would we even want to do this, right? Why would we want to integrate AI into this process? Well, as we've been saying, preparing for an interview is thinking out loud, and you'll hear us repeat many times that you do need to be saying these things out loud, right? If you would just practice in your head, you aren't preparing for an interview. That reflection is going to make you more articulate in an interview. And we're not trying to predict, right? And even when I do traditional interview prep with applicants, we're never trying to predict what questions might be asked. We are instead preparing ourselves to respond in real time to different types of questions. And so if you improve your self-awareness, and how you react in different situations and how you approach different types of questions, you're better prepared for an interview, as opposed to, oh, I've got my answer memorized for that particular question, which nobody likes talking to somebody who has responses to common questions memorized, right? That's just sort of weird. So if we stop and think, what is the purpose of fellowships interviews? Many of the awards that we work with have an interview round, many of them do not. Um, and I find, usually the higher stakes ones tend to have an interview round where they want to see, what this person is like in real life. But they want to know about your curiosity, your composure, your ability to perform under pressure, your ability to clarify and express ideas. And so we would recommend that you think about the generative AI as a mirror, reflecting your own words, ideas, and thoughts, not a mask that you're putting on, and helping present perfection, right?
Also, I'll just add that a lot of times, whether for a fellowship or another type of interview, a lot of times it's also just trying to confirm that you are who you say you are on the paper, right? So that your personal statement, your resume, your letters of recommendation, um, were not, created out of thin air or, exaggerated to the nth degree. So that's another thing that they're testing sometimes, which isn't, I think, thinking of them in that way, it makes it a little less scary. Like I'm just helping them understand that I am who I said I am in my application.
Yeah. And that's an excellent point. And in fact, many of the fellowships have changed their approaches a little bit, changed their prompts a little bit. I know the Rhodes Scholarship, for instance, got to a point several years ago where they were tired of meeting students who do not resemble the students that they had read about in the written applications. And they were very plain about that. And so it's really changed our strategy as well as to get students away from the idea of perfection and performance and into authenticity, because there needs to be that alignment between who you are on paper and who you are in person. Um, and so that's one of the things we really try to do with our students. So, when we're thinking about a scripted response, a well-rehearsed, a practiced response, it's static. It doesn't adapt to nuances of questions. Like the old saying is, if the only tool you have is a hammer, you go around seeing everything as nails, right? And so if you've got two or three answers prepared, you're going to feel obligated to shoehorn them into the conversation, which I would refer to that as brittle, meaning that it breaks very easily. That approach is not sustainable, as opposed to a more reflective response, or approach. It's going to be more authentic. It's going to be adaptive to different types of questions or nuanced questions. And it'll make you more confident, right? Because there'd be nothing worse than having three or four rehearsed answers ready to go and none of the questions relate, right? And then you're not able to adapt. And so we're going to be thinking about how then to employ the generative AI to help us be more reflective, right? We could use it to generate questions, right? Thinking about different themes of questions or different ways of framing questions we might get. And that could show us topics that we might not have considered, right? I wouldn't have thought they'd ask me that question, but yeah, actually that's a good bank of questions there. And as we start to generate answers and we can type them in, we can generate the content or the way that we respond to a question, and it might help us think about the frameworks. Have I bracketed the question correctly? Am I providing solid evidence to support my claims? Is the logic of my answer there, right? Again, you have the luxury of time, but it's really useful to see patterns in the way that you respond to things. And then we can actually push towards meta coaching as well, meaning analyzing your answers. And you start to realize, oh, wow, I always seem to pivot towards values-based answers here. Or, wow, I always take a while to get to my main point. I need to start putting my answer up front, right? And starting to recognize your own patterns and behaviors, I think, is a useful tool. So examples of what we would consider more useful prompts, generate 10 possible questions I might get in a Fulbright interview based on my statement of grant purpose, right? That's generating potential questions, giving you an opportunity to think of how an interview panel might react to what you've written. And it's going to give you work to reflect and respond to, right? You could give it your resume, ask me questions one at a time, and after each one, help me organize my answers using the STAR method. That's a very intentional and organized practice method right there. Because you're stopping and you're reflecting after each one and you're giving it a structure. And for those of you who don't know, the STAR method is a tried and true approach to answering behavioral questions. STAR stands for situation, task, action, response, right? Very good way to answer questions that start with, tell us about a time where you had to resolve a conflict with a coworker or something like that. And then ask me 10 behavioral questions to help me practice for the upcoming interview. When I finish, summarize what strengths or values came through in most of my responses. And so um, that is more pattern recognition in your own responses, meaning, okay, what do I seem to talk about a lot that I'm not aware of? Or do I always go in one direction with this? Or are there blind spots in the way that I respond to questions? So, different grades of that mirror use of AI, helping us find patterns in the things that we might not have noticed. Yeah, there's actually one fellowship that we work with. It's a federal fellowship that requires applicants to respond in the STAR method. You don't get a choice in it. So as you're thinking about developing your own prompts, as you saw in our opening exercise, it's important to be specific about the context. Tell it who you are, what kind of interviews you're preparing for, include the criteria and written materials. And I say, if appropriate, as we've pointed out since the beginning, as an ASU student, you have the luxury of an ASU specific version of many generative AI, particularly ChatGPT. It remains within a walled garden. Many folks may not be comfortable with putting their own writing, their personal statements, their research proposals into the large language model if you were not using what they call the walled garden, right? If we're just feeding the language model with our personal statement, some people might not be comfortable with that, right? They might see that as a threat to their intellectual property. And I get that, right? So that's an ethical decision or a practical decision you would need to make. Um, as you're writing your prompts, be thinking about process, not so much performance. And you're not using it to try to identify winning answers, but really thinking about how to organize your responses, structure things logically, how to frame questions and responses. And I think it's also very good for asking for structure and feedback, patterns, strengths, gaps, all that sort of stuff. There are a lot of really good AI conversation simulators out there. Um, some better than others, but I found them very effective ways of trying out or prototyping different approaches. Follow-up questions, right? We can instruct it what persona we want it to adopt or how difficult we want it to be. So you could ask it to continue iterating your answers with prompts like, hey, ask me a hard follow-up question after I give my first answer, or make it more complex, or whatever assertions I made, challenge them in a response, right? Really just you can make it as combative as you want to make it, or as critical as you want to make it, which is kind of the interesting thing about generative AI. It's you are in control, which is what a lot of people seem to be afraid of. But you have to remember there has to be a human element, right? So I would strongly recommend as you're composing or reflecting on your responses, read them aloud. And if it sounds overpolished, if it sounds unnatural, or it sounds performative, this is not a good interview response, right? Because nobody wants to sit through a memorized performance. Shay, any other
Then I would
cautions
just
to
say,
add there? Yeah.
yeah, I would just say that that goes back into, what I said earlier about interviews are in part a test to ensure you are who you appear to be on the paper. And if you have overly rehearsed responses, any human will be able to identify that quickly, and then it will not come across as they're being able to see who you truly are, right? Because anybody can rehearse a response to say, anything they want to say. And if it's not coming across as authentic, then that part of the test of the interview, they're not getting an answer to.
Exactly. So this is a link to one of the tools that we have actually found useful for practicing that, practicing aloud. Shay, you want to explain a little bit more about how this tool works?
Sorry, having trouble getting my mouse to the unmute. Yeah, so if you go to the link that is on the screen, I also just put it in the chat. The QR code takes you as well there as well. It's going to take you to an ASU career development page, and on that page, it will be a link to Sun Devil Career Prep. This is an online module to help you with preparing for um, the career journey, if you will. So you can sign up for an account just with your ASU right, like everything else through ASU, your single sign on. And then it's going to ask you to update or create a resume. So if you have one that's already completely up to date, you can just upload that. If not, it will take you through sections that would typically be on a resume and ask you to input information about your experience, your education, your extracurriculars, volunteering, all of that. And then tying in with what we've been talking about, it's going to ask you to add specific opportunities, job postings, internship postings, fellowship descriptions that you are interested in pursuing. And then you'll be able to do mock interviews. These are brief virtual interviews with a generative AI interviewer or with an AI interviewer, excuse me, who's going to ask you questions that are both based on your resume as well as the job posting or fellowship description. And you can practice and start to identify those patterns, get some feedback from it. You can do this many times with many different opportunities that you're pursuing. So it's a great way, especially as a starting point in your interview prep, not the end results, because you want to interact with another real life human as you're preparing and getting more comfortable with interview questions. But when I say rinse and repeat, I mean more so doing that with different opportunities that you're applying for. Maybe only once or twice for an individual thing that you're applying for through this system, and then translating that into practicing with a peer, a mentor, if there's a faculty member who's willing to do that with you, if you have a supervisor in your current role, those kinds of folks, trusted individuals, they don't have to be an expert in the field of what you're going into. Just that simple practicing with another human asking you those types of questions can be really helpful to calm some of those jitters, which I know we're going to be talking about shortly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and the other thing to keep in mind, anytime dealing with AI is the old computer science expression GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. So if you put in minimal information, if you put in minimal information about yourself, about the opportunity, the questions aren't going to be as sophisticated or complex as they might be. So do take the effort to put in good information for it. There are some traps here, right? And the slip from effective and productive to ineffective and unproductive is um, pretty dangerous, right? So these aren't exactly unethical, right? I'll put them in the red zone because they're just not useful, right? Over scripting, real interviews are spontaneous, right? You're reacting in real time. You don't want to seem robotic, right? So instead, focus on the frameworks, right? What is there a system for me framing my answers? Is there a pattern that I can learn that helps me think on the fly, right? Asking it to impersonate panels, it's just unrealistic. It's unlikely that you'd be able to match the persona of real people that are going to be on those panels. But I think it would be useful instead that as the AI is generating potential questions, have a partner read them to you, right? Rather than you reading them on the screen. I think make it a more collaborative exercise, and that could be far more productive. And just kind of endlessly polishing your answers, right? Like thinking that you're going to work with the AI to develop the perfect answer, it's just not going to get us there, because the next version of that question you might get might have a slightly different angle or have an add-on to it or a different framing. It doesn't improve your delivery, right? So the actual oral delivery of what you're doing has to be on point. So again, practicing out loud, getting feedback from another person. Um, as well, working with the AI isn't going to help you simulate eye contact or body language. It's not going to give you feedback on if your posture exudes confidence, if you're talking too fast, if your answers are too long, if you're talking too loudly or too softly, or you're monotone or alarmingly expressive. And it can't help you recover from that body blow of a question you just weren't ready for, right? And so it's not paying attention to how long you're taking to think or if you seem nervous. And so it also can't assess whether or not you're just connecting, right? Because it's just a computer program. It's not a thinking thing. And it doesn't know if you're making that connection. And it'll simulate that. It'll pretend, and it'll be very laudatory and very congratulatory. And whatever your answer you give, it'll probably tell you did a great job. Um, but in reality, it doesn't know if you're being warm or not. It doesn't know if you landed that connection with the other human that's asking the question. So, try this instead. Based on your materials, and if you're comfortable sharing those, you generate 3 to 5 questions, type your answers into the AI, test out your thinking, ask for feedback on the structure, content, and framing, not necessarily what to say, but just how you're framing that content. And then do a human round. Have a partner ask you the same questions and then give your answers without looking at what you previously wrote. Um, Getting that feedback, and again, as Shay mentioned, this doesn't have to be as somebody that's specialist in your field. You want the feedback you want from the human is, did that seem natural? Did it feel rehearsed? Did I seem comfortable? Right? Those are the kind of the questions that we really want to answer. And I would agree. And Shay, I don't know how you feel about doing interviews. I've done so many interviews on the interviewer side of the table. I'm not scared of being interviewed anymore. I know what it's like. I don't mind it as much, but I know for most people, they find this incredibly stress inducing. What's your reaction to interviews? Do you find them nerve-wracking or do you find them a fun challenge?
So um, I used to find them extremely nerve wracking.
Yeah.
In fact, my first full time professional interview out of college, um, I was chased down by who would become my new boss in the future afterwards because I had broken out in such horrible hives that they thought I was having an allergic reaction and were worried that when I left, like something was terrible was going to happen to
Yeah.
me. So, that's how nervous I used to be in interviews. Since I've gotten further along, both I've done more interviews as the interviewee, but also, like you said, I've done so many on the interviewer side, both in practice with students, applicants, right, but also actually interviewing future colleagues that would come to work with me. So it's gotten rid of a lot of my own jitters, but there's still sometimes when I'm going into something, especially if it's something that is a little bit more unfamiliar to me, or I'm really, really excited about the thing at hand, those jitters still appear because I'm excited.
Right. Yeah, and that's a really good point. We'll get into that in a moment. Before we move on, I mean, you also asked a really good question. How do we realize we're over scripting? Using AI regularly sometimes leads us to adopt the AI's way of speaking or answering. Does it make us lose our authenticity? How can we avoid that? Um, yeah, I've got a couple of thoughts about that. I think the most obvious one is that we don't want the AI generating responses for us at all, right? We want to generate questions and then maybe assess or provide observations on what we answer, right? But we want to stop short of having it generate, say it this way, or here's an example of how you should say it. Is that how you would approach it, Shay? Or
Yeah, another thing I would say is I think it's oftentimes both with our writing and possible, oral responses, we're sometimes asking it to, how could I make that better? How could this be more polished, more professional? Which is going to, again, fall into that trap of you didn't necessarily originally ask it to generate a response for you, but now it is because you're giving more of these like kind of vague prompts to it of improving when
Right.
really, as we've been talking about, it's about, can you identify my gaps, my patterns, my themes, my thread, those kinds of things, as opposed to trying to make things better or more polished or more professional. I think that will help you avoid starting to speak like the AI and losing your own voice in this process.
Yeah, it's really good advice. In my own AI use, I try to treat it like a knowledgeable friend, right? Somebody who understands writing, and so I'll ask questions like, this is what I'm trying to do with this, right? I'm trying to achieve this. This is my goal for this, or I want this to appeal to this age group of students, or giving it some, specific context, and then saying, but I'm worried that it's doing this, or I'm worried that it's too complex, or do you think, and basically inviting it to give a broad spectrum answer rather than saying, yeah, you should do this, you should do that, right? And it's always going to ask, would you like me to craft an example? It's always going to try to be helpful, and it usually jumps into generating text. And a lot of times I will simply tell it, please don't generate any text for me. I'm just looking to assess and evaluate here, right? And it'll be like, okay, cool. Yeah, I'm sorry, be apologetic. But I think if you give it very clear instructions of what you want and what you don't want, you'll find it, makes that navigation much easier.
The
Um, you
other
know,
thing, oh,
Sorry, go ahead.
sorry. Yeah, the other thing I would add is it's simply just the over practicing that
Yeah,
when you start to get into that scripting as well, especially over practicing of the same responses, right? So at a certain point, you kind of just need to stop and accept that you're as prepared as you're going to get and go into it, into the interview, instead of just continuing over and over again to practice, whether that be with AI or with a human person,
yeah,
or in the mirror, whatever it is. You'll start to get scripted and authentic type of responses the more you
yeah.
practice.
Agreed. Yeah, when we actually work in a systematic way to help our finalists preparing for interviews, there's a magic number, and it differs from student to student. But I rarely do more than 4 practice sessions or 5, because I think there's really diminishing returns after that, because then people start to question everything that they've done, or they start again just kind of giving up and just giving rote responses. So I think there's a sweet spot where you want to remain a little bit excited, and exactly what Shay was talking about. The anxiety that we feel going into an interview is actually our excitement, right? That is normal. We're doing this, we're interviewing because this is something we want very badly. And so it's a signal that you care. So it's about reframing that sensation. Our body is giving us information that we're excited. We don't want to get rid of those nerves. We don't want to be bored in that interview room. We don't want to be stone faced. But I would encourage you to figure out, how do I turn that into focus and curiosity? And that's another way that we can actually apply AI. And not a lot of people would have considered, like, how can I use it to help notice patterns in the way that I'm framing things, and actually, develop some more productive thought patterns. And so we might even consider this a cognitive approach, right? Um, some of us feel a little creeped out about, talking about our feelings to AI, but again, changing the way that we talk about ourselves, changing our thought patterns can change our behavior, right? So I might, type in, I'm feeling anxious about this interview. Can you help me understand what this anxiety is trying to tell me? How can I use that insight to prepare more intentionally? And with a little help, it's going to draw from some very good sources to help think about performance psychology here, right? I could instruct it to ask as a performance coach, so it's telling you what angle or persona do you want me to adopt. Help me translate my physical symptoms of nervousness, fast heartbeat, shallow breathing, tension, hives. I don't know if we can control that so much, but into cues for grounding, focus, and energy. There are some very specific physical behaviors and patterns and strategies you can use to ground yourself, to calm yourself, to get ready to perform. And so in this case, you could develop a pre-interview body routine. In my particular case, I pay attention to my breathing. I make my feet are on the floor. I'm paying attention to how every part of my body feels, as opposed to letting my mind spin, right? That might work for you. It might not work as well for somebody else. So you can develop some different strategies. Remind me of how interviews fit into a larger arc of growth. Help me articulate 3 reframes that transform this event from a test to a conversation, from pressure to curiosity, from judgment to discovery. And again, you're just in an iterative feedback loop trying to reframe your thought patterns about this particular opportunity, right? So it can be a useful exercise in that way, because again, language is patterns, right? And that's what it's very good at doing. As we're thinking about our emotions, the pattern I would encourage you to think about is reframe, balance, reset. So reframe the thing that's causing you the anxiety, moving that away from a threat to that energy to care. This is not a threat. This is an opportunity for you to do something exciting and interesting, right? So we need to reframe how we're experiencing that. Um, when we're trying to balance, we're trying to figure out the difference between productive preparation and over rehearsal, as Shay was just saying. How can I tell when I'm crossing the line? Being metacognitive and self-aware. And the more time you spend in that self-aware phase, the more prepared you actually are for this, right? And then really thinking about resetting, like that pre-interview ritual I talked about. For some people, they just might recite song lyrics or a poem. Other people, they're going to touch their ear 3 times. Watch athletes. There are so many athletes that have these repetitive physical motions you can see before they shoot a free throw, or before they take a golf swing, or before they serve in tennis. That's their way of prepping themselves mentally and physically to perform, right? And so there's a lot of evidence to support this. But in case you haven't picked up this theme yet, right? There has to be a human component to your preparation. Again, because emotions are involved here. The AI can simulate discussion, it can simulate reflection, it can simulate emotion, but it's not actually doing any of that, right? So your composure is going to develop as you practice out loud, even if it's to yourself, right? Even if it's in the car on the way there. Um, Looking for those mock interviews to reveal your tone, timing, and body language. And then have a partner read AI generated questions. You can't see the questions, and maybe you prompted it to say, generate 5 unrelated questions, right? And being able to simulate how do you respond and react when things don't go as planned. And rely on other people to sense your warmth, your curiosity, your authenticity, right? These are things that the AI won't really be able to sense. So always keep people involved. And yeah, you can practice. I mean, I think you've gotten the indication from what Shane and I have been saying that there are formal ways to get about this, right? Um, in thinking about what actually goes into a successful interview answer, we encourage applicants to pause a lot. Most people, when they're very nervous, immediately start talking, and they let their mind catch up. That empty space, that silence, tends to frighten people. When in reality, on our side of the table, you taking your time to gather your thoughts shows confidence, right? You're not afraid to let that silence sit there for 2 seconds while you gather your response. And that shows respect for the question as well. 30 to second answers, 30 to 60-second answers. In your early stages, use a timer, right? And I think that career services, I haven't used the new platform, but the one that we used before would have a timer, so you could really see in real time like how long you've
Yep.
been talking, right? Try
I'll
it
add
tonight.
to, oh, on the pausing before you speak as well. A lot of times we are thinking about how we're going to respond while people are still talking.
Mm.
This goes in life, but especially in interviews and especially when we're nervous, right? And so that pause and giving yourself permission for that pause can hopefully help with that um, habit of thinking about your response while somebody is still talking. Because if you've done that, you've oftentimes missed a part of the question, missed something else that the interviewer was saying that you could have a potential to connect with, right? It's a conversation. Interviews are conversations. And so if you allow yourself to pause, you will be less likely to get caught up in the thinking so that you're ready to respond as soon as they stop talking.
Absolutely. That's such solid advice. And we wouldn't think of listening, right, as an important skill to deploy in an interview, but it absolutely is. And it really listen to the question. I've asked questions of applicants so many times where they didn't quite grasp what I was asking or answering a question I didn't ask. This is a conversation. And so another trick for that, I don't even call it a trick. I just call it good practice. Stop your answers a little short of where you think you should, right? Oftentimes you've already answered the question, you've said more than enough. But doing so invites follow-up questions. And when we have follow-up questions and responses and follow-up questions, now we're into a conversation, not an oral exam, right? There's a difference between those two things. Tough questions, right? We get that question, we just don't know how to handle it. We're just not prepared for that. They're asking us something we don't know about. The first thing I would tell you is don't bluff, right? Don't pretend like you know if you actually don't. But pivot to what you do know, right? So, I'm afraid I don't know, or I'm not as familiar with that as I'd like to be. But here's how I would approach it. Here's how I would learn. I'm not sure, but this is how I would answer it, right? Proceed from your values, right? Really thinking about how you would approach it, something you don't understand. False binaries, either or questions. Do you think, man is infinitely evil or infinitely good, right? In reality, that's not an either or question, right? And so whatever option you choose in an either or question is going to be wrong. So don't jump at the first answer. Again, you're not trying to be right. You're trying to be in a conversation with other human beings. And if you get pushback, right, if people seem like they're jumping on your answer, don't get defensive, right? Stay curious. A great way to reframe that is like, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way before, right? Um, and try not to sound condescending when you say it, but and you can use AI to generate a lot of possibilities, right? You could ask it to generate increasingly complex questions, follow-up questions, right? So you give an answer and then it starts generating questions. It will do this infinitely, right? Unless you tell it to stop. Pretend you're a skeptical interviewer, right? You can give it more of a persona. That says, approach me more critically, or promote me as a research scientist, or approach me, as somebody in the humanities who doesn't understand my field. But ask it to challenge some of the assumptions that you're making. Excuse me. Now, just in terms of delivery, probably the most common feedback we give is that you need to slow down. When people get nervous, they tend to talk very fast. It's usually how you're dealing with a guilty person too, right? But you want to insert pauses as much as possible. Control your breathing. Don't let yourself run out of an open door right away. Stop, think, talk. And particularly if you've been going for a minute and you need to stop and let an idea sink in, right? Insert that pause. And it's a great way to emphasize what you're saying too. Think about it as adding some italics or boldface to what you've just said. Uh, this goes beyond saying, but smile, right? This should be a fun experience. It should be something you're excited to do. Think about what can I do? Let's pretend that these people are guests in my home. They've stopped here. I wasn't expecting them, but how can I make them feel welcome, right? How can I make them feel at ease? And if they have that reaction to the way that you behave, then they're more likely to be receptive to what you're saying. And then eye contact is important, even on a Zoom interview where I'm staring at a little camera. But a lot of times when applicants give responses to complex questions, their eyes tend to drift up to the ceiling, or they're looking off to the side, but you need to share eye contact with everyone in the room. And you notice that we put soft eye contact, right? I've had applicants who've been given this advice and they decided to, like, I am not breaking eye contact with the person who asked me the question, which can be a little creepy, right? So spread it around the room, primarily respond to the person who fielded the question, who posed the question, and then make sure you're including other people in the conversation, right? And really find a willing partner, thinking about body posture and body language. Maybe you're somebody who talks with their hands too much. Maybe you're somebody who jiggles a foot when you talk, get a friend you trust, and really you can do this as a service for each other, right? And of course, we're happy to help with this as well. Oh, great question. Um, and I didn't think to address this in the presentation. You also asked, I'm an international student and I'm still working on my English. My biggest fear is not understanding the question. And I think this applies broadly to everyone, not just people who, for whom English is not their first language. Um, Shay, what is your advice to somebody if they're not entirely sure that they understood the question?
Well, I think one, that's where some of the tools we've been talking about today can be helpful, right? And you, some of that follow-up question you could pose to your AI partner in this interview prep is, or your human partner is, did I understand that? Did I fully address that question? Was I missing components? Did I, did I miss the mark? Is there something else that this question was looking for? Um, and also, you don't want to ask it with every question, but in a real life interview, once in a while, it is okay if the question was particularly complex, or sometimes interviewers will pose questions in very convoluted ways where the question is actually not clear to begin with. So it's okay to ask for clarification before you give your response, and or after you've given your response, confirm with them that you've fully addressed what they were looking for. Again, don't want to do it every question, but it is perfectly acceptable to do it, once or twice during an interview, especially with more complex questions. But I think the practice can really beforehand can be helpful for you in that.
Yeah. Yeah, would I would steer away from saying, I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question, to if I understood the question correctly, you're asking me, or are you asking me, right? That's more proactive than saying I didn't understand the question, because that might make them feel defensive too for, having asked a convoluted question. And yeah, sometimes I'm not entirely sure there's even a question mark in what the interviewer just said, right? It was more of a comment. And so don't be afraid to make sure that you're answering the question that they ask, because we don't want to waste everyone's time, you know. But excellent question. That applies for everyone, not just people who are still building English, right? Um, I've heard it said that, and this actually came from somebody who served on a Rhodes Scholarship Committee. You can't win the interview, but you can lose it. Meaning, if we're trying to master it, if we're trying to treat this like an exam or a dissertation defense or something like that, but there are things you can do that just take the energy out or change the way people think or feel about you. Instead that, in the interview, I would like to say, yeah, this is the person I want to work with, 40 hours a week, for, the foreseeable future. I would take a long car ride with this person. I would let this person watch my children, right? All these things, as we're thinking about, is this somebody I want to include in what it is I'm doing? So yeah, nobody's going to argue their way into that, but they're certainly going to, push you away, right?
Something I'll add that's not necessarily applicable for fellowships interviews,
Yeah.
but for job or internship interviews, you're interviewing them too, right? You're trying to gather, as much insight as you can through that process and that conversation about what that experience will actually entail, whether you want to work with them 40 hours a week, whether you
Right.
want to do the same things. And I think trying to keep that frame of mind going into those specific types of interviews can also be helpful in alleviating some of that pressure to have the perfect answer, or just those general nerves. So,
Yeah. Yeah. So to close up today, I mean, ultimately, the takeaway I hope here is that yes, we can employ generative AI as a tool to help us tamp down our anxieties, to help us feel more confident, to allow us opportunity to practice. If we go into it thinking that it's going to give us the perfect answers to questions or predict the questions we're going to get, that's not an effective use, right? That is not going to help us achieve our goal. Ultimately, our goal is to have you go into that interview room, be focused on what you're being asked, feel confident in what you reply, and walk out of that room feeling that they got to know you. And if they didn't select you, That wasn't because you misrepresented yourself. It just wasn't a good fit, right? We don't want you walking out of the rooms thinking, oh, I should have said that. Oh, I shouldn't have done that. We want you to feel comfortable and confident that you did your best. And we do think there's opportunities here for you to do that. So, well, any comments, questions, anything on the minds of people here today that we could address? No. Well, wonderful. So again, this will be archived on our YouTube channel, and if you'd like to see the uh, other parts of this series, which I think put together cumulatively, I think would be a excellent preparation for a lot of college students as we're entering into this uncertain era of AI. But yeah, I can't thank you enough for joining us today. Shay, thank you as always for your perspective and all the work that you do with our students as well. Thank you all very much.